Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I see the numbers going up quite nicely. And we'll just give a few seconds just for everyone to get into the webinar. Okay. Number count seems to have stopped, so I'll continue. Just a very good morning to everyone. I'm Steve Morgan, Head of Policy and Infrastructure at RECOUP, and welcome to the penultimate webinar in our series of webinars this autumn. This one is about the launch and findings from the 2023 RECOUP UK Household Plastic Packaging Collection Survey. I'm also joined by my colleagues Tom Macbeth and Laura Hutchings, who'll be doing a great job researching, completing the data analysis, and producing the report. The webinar was scheduled for an hour, but I think it will last probably around 30 to 45 minutes, so you might get some time back to your day today. Just a few words about the running of the webinar. If you have a question during the session, just use the Q&A function. These will be used for questions after the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and slides and the recording will be made available later in the week. In addition, members will now be able to download the survey report for free from the RECOUP website, which is available in the members area now. There will also be a press release, which you will receive and see soon. Next slide, please, Tom. So just before we start on the main content of the webinar, I just wanted to say a few words about RECOUP. We do have some non-members on the webinar today. So we are the UK's leading independent authority and trusted voice on plastics resource efficiency and recycling. As a registered charity, our work is supported by a network of over 180 members who are made up of polymer producers, plastic packaging manufacturers, brands, retailers, waste management providers, local authorities, recyclers, academia, and everyone else in between. Our members share our commitments, including a more sustainable use of plastics, increased plastics recycling, improved environmental performance, and meeting legislative requirements. And really, collaboration is central to everything we do. Underpinned by evidence, we try to connect the whole value chain to keep plastics in a circular system that also protects the environment. Next slide, please, Tom. Our activities are actually very varied. Policy and legislation, recyclability, and more recently, reuse and life cycle analysis are important areas of our work. There's even a new service for members, a plastics life cycle assessment library, which we work collaboratively on with the British Plastics Federation. We produce a variety of research reports and guidance, including plastic recycling infrastructure, packaging recyclability, and now, excitingly, reusability by design as well. Educating the public on the recycling of plastics is delivered through our consumer-facing Pledge to Recycle Plastics initiative, which includes extensive citizens' insight research, which we've completed. And on that subject, there will be a new report launched very soon about the outputs from our latest research. Next slide, please, Tom. So as previously mentioned, this is the penultimate in a series of autumn webinars from RECOUP. 3 have taken place so far: understanding recycled content verification systems, particularly important for the plastic packaging tax, implementing reuse systems, and also communicating packaging recyclability. The final one, Bring It Back, Making Reusables a Reality, a project we've been involved in over the last year or so, takes place next week. The previous webinars were free for members, and members can get access to the recording through the members area on our website. And if you want to find out more about membership, please do get in touch. Next slide, please, Tom. So just a bit of background about this webinar. The UK Household Plastic Packaging Collection Survey is one of our sort of core main reports we do every year. We've been doing it since 1995. And it's really providing evidence about how much plastic is collected, but also the issues and challenges that surround that as well. And it's really, really important at the moment. As we navigate this time of change, we need to reference well-informed information, evidence-based information to inform good policy for the future. So what did it look like back in 1995 when we first did our first report survey? There was 425 tons of plastic bottles were collected for recycling, mostly from Bring schemes. And it was really in its infancy back then. It's only really since about 2007, looking back at our data, when curbside collection has really started to kick in and more plastic pots, tubs and trays were collected, did the levels actually increase. And service provision for plastic packaging has increased over that time as well. But it took until 2019 for every local authority to collect plastic bottles as part of their curbside recycling scheme. Now, there are actually nearly 600,000 tons of household plastic packaging collected for recycling. So this is the plastic packaging you and I use every day. The 2023 report continues to look at the trends and progression around plastic packaging and how it's collected. And it's really, really important now. The announcement from DEFRA around simpler recycling, and of course, other nations will be doing something similar, I'm sure, makes it very, very important to have evidence-based information. So without delaying any further, I'll pass you across to Tom and Laura, who will take you through the main findings of the report. Again, if you have any questions as we go through, just pop them in the Q&A and we'll take them after the presentations have been completed. Thank you very much. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Steve. And good morning, everyone. So we've had a bit of an overview from Steve of the history of the survey, but I'll give a bit of background to this year's survey specifically. So the local authorities in the UK were surveyed earlier in the year, back in April, May time, asked a number of questions around the tonnages of plastics that were collected, the challenges they faced, the opportunities they saw, opinions around policy, litter and other communication aspects. This went out to all 361 local authorities. This is a slight drop on previous years in terms of number of councils, which is a long-running trend due to councils merging their operations in England. It also went to county councils and waste partnerships as well. We received 77% response rate, which is the highest to date, and this is fed into the data in the survey that I will share going forward. So one of the key areas of the data that we've had to update every year is around the amount of packaging placed on the market. So we receive the tonnage information from the councils themselves in terms of what's collected. The actual placed on the market data is something that has been updated year on year, originating from the pack flow report from Valpac and also the COVID-19 impact report updates that were released back in 2020. We have updated this figure again this year. We're seeing around an estimated around 10% drop in plastic packaging placed on the market over the last 5 years, and around 5% in the last year as well. So that's given us a lower placed on the market figure for 2022 than we had in 2021. This has come to 1,375,000 tonnes, so 1.3 million tonnes. And this breaks down as 605,000 tonnes of bottles, 440,000 tonnes of pots, tubs and trays, and 330,000 tonnes of films and flexibles. Within the pots, tubs and tray fraction, there is an other category. So this is predominantly rigid plastics that have fallen within that waste stream. We have done made some efforts and done some research into attributing this to the appropriate sections. So, for example, bottle tops with bottles. But there is more work to be done there to unpick that data and placed on the market data overall, which is something we expect and hope to see going into 2024, that we'll have a clearer picture of that. So to understand the provision, so the messaging and the allowance that local authorities give to their citizens, we do desk-based research, checking local authority websites as well as through the questionnaire. And this is to see how they communicate their collection of plastic bottles, plastic pots, tubs and trays, and plastic films and flexibles. So as Steve mentioned, all local authorities have provided a curbside collection of plastic bottles and have done since September 2019. So that's all 361 across the UK. Pot stubs and trays, although it has increased considerably since we first started collating the data back in the mid-2000s, I think pot stubs and trays were first sort of widely collected. But it has remained the same at around 88%, and that is roughly the same despite the change in local authorities. So there's still a huge amount of material there available to capture from those remaining 12%, but not as much as we see in the films and flexible category, which has fallen in terms of provision percentage for the 6th year in a row. So it was as high as 21% in 2016. This is down to 12% in 2022. Of course, both these items will be mandated to be collected for recycling through the simpler recycling legislation. So it'll be interesting to see the local authorities develop their collections ahead of that over the next few years. One thing that's not considered necessarily within the film fraction is the growth in recent years of front of store collections, so non-municipal collections of films and flexibles from consumer. So there will be an element of the tonnage that's collected that will fall within that fraction rather than within the local authority fraction, but we don't expect that to be a huge figure. In terms of tonnages collected, we've actually seen a decrease on 2021's data. So year on year, we've seen a decrease, but proportionately, compared to the amount we've seen placed on the market decrease, there's actually a higher and similar collection rate. So plastic bottles, 384,000 tonnes is slightly lower than last year, although the collection rate is still 63%. Plastic pot stubs and trays is lower than last year in terms of tonnage, but the collection rate's actually up to 39%. And films and flexibles has dropped slightly as well. But as I mentioned, this could be in part due to the development of non-municipal collections for that material as well. And of course, the drop in service provision from some local authorities. This gives us an overall collection rate of 42% and tonnage collected of 578,000 tonnes. So as I say, this is a decrease in terms of tonnage on the 2022 survey, 2021 data, but in terms of the proportion compared to what's been placed on the market, it's actually an increase. The decrease in terms of placed on the market we could attribute to a few things, but particularly in the last year, in the last 5 years. I mean, in terms of lightweight of packaging, we've seen for a long time material substitution in terms of what's being placed on the market, but also the impacts of obviously the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis that hit particularly hard last year. Both of these will, of course, changes to the markets in terms of demand, consumer buying habits, and ultimately the amount of plastic packaging that was consumed and ended up waste arising in the waste stream. There are some figures to put those tonnages into context, and what Stephen was mentioning before. Over 100 billion plastic bottles have been collected since 1994, which is around 5 million tonnes. And around 2 million tonnes of plastic pot stubs and trays have been collected for recycling as well since 2007. This is a graph we've shown every year, so going back to 2003 when the policy brought in recycling collection from curbside. There's a steady development of the growth of curbside collection and volumes. But we can see this is the first time there's actually been a drop in tonnages that have been collected. But as mentioned before, this doesn't account for the change in the place in the market figure. There's a number of bits of information within the survey. So in terms of the amount of plastic packaging placed on the market per household and the comparative collection figure, you can see on the left, this shows that there's a huge amount of potential for collecting more curbside material. And simpler recycling legislation will presumably and hopefully do something to address that. We're seeing a slow development towards more source separated collections. This is often more to do with the collection of paper and glass separately from other materials, and it is a completely source separate collection, but it is something we've noticed in recent years, councils moving towards that. Although we have also seen anecdotal cases of individual councils moving back towards a dry mix recycling stream, presumably due to the costs that are involved. Each year as well, we've looked at the types of container that are used and the inconsistencies in collection. So 75% of councils, which is the same figure as last year, use a wheelie bin to collect material at curbside. The others are using bags or boxes or a combination of one or the other or all three. and the bin colours as well. So 33% of those that use bins are using blue bins, but the amount of inconsistency even to that level is significant, down to the point where there's 10 different colours. Some have different wheel bin colours and lids. It's just to highlight the level of complexity and inconsistency from one local authority to another. In terms of the frequency of collection, most local authorities, 71%, prefer or utilize a fortnightly collection for recycling waste or the recycling stream that includes plastic. 19% have a weekly collection, 10% have a 3 or 4 weekly collection, and then there are a couple of local authorities that have a sort of a nuanced collection frequency, but fortnightly still seems to be the most consistent method of collection. That will obviously be significantly influenced by the makeup of the council. So a inner city council, you might expect, is more likely to have a weekly collection than a rural council, purely the logistics of the buildup of waste. These are the overall recycling rates, and these are for household and commercial figures. So the declared as recycling rate is from the EA. The place on the market figure is a combination of updated Valpac figures, and the recycling rate is a combination of the two. So 1,154,000 tonnes was declared for recycled in 2022. 46% of this was exported, 54% of it was processed domestically. So to put that in context, 535,000 tonnes that was exported. And I'll come back onto that shortly, but it does highlight the need for more infrastructure in the UK. So separately, we did release an infrastructure report, a household, not just household, sorry, commercial and household waste infrastructure report back in 2022. This looked at the capacities for sorting and reprocessing of plastic packaging in the UK. And the findings from it were there is a lack of UK infrastructure for the reprocessing of what we would term challenging materials, so food contact packaging, films and flexibles, non-bottle PET, and pot stubs and trays. In the survey, 82% of local authorities that use a non-circular disposal method, or the treatment of residual waste, are using energy recovery. There's still 16% using landfill, but this is something we've seen decrease year on year as well. Additional to that, 34% reported that they currently recover plastic waste from a residual waste stream, although tonnages were very low. On the right, just going back to infrastructure, you can see a map of recycling infrastructure in the UK, so reprocessors for household, commercial and industrial, sorting facilities, and chemical and non-mechanical recycling. This is a section in both the survey, but also the infrastructure report, which is available on the RECOUP website. Separately, earlier this year, we released a report on household waste recycling centres, so TIPs, for lack of a better term, to try and understand the amount of plastic that was going uncollected for recycling, or potentially was available for recycling. So we estimated around 120,000 tonnes of packaging and non-packaging plastic was collected at these sites, and there was around 1,025 sites across the UK. But this material is predominantly not recycled, and that's due to other priorities at these council-run sites, whether it be heavier or more valuable materials that are more likely to increase the recycling rate or are more valuable in terms of recycle it, whereas the plastic material that's disposed of at these sites was more problematic and more challenging, more contaminated. So just to come back to exports, we've done this year on year since I think about 2019 now. We've seen a decrease in exports in 2022. So it's down to 46%. It was around 47% in 2021. This is something we're expecting to see increase for 2023, though. It's looking at around 50%. Within these figures, I should clarify as well that this is looking at commercial and household figures. So whilst local authorities appear to prefer to process their material in the UK, and a lot of this will be commercial rather than household material, it is interesting to see the trends in terms of in terms of priorities, particularly when it comes to UK processing. So like I say, it has moved towards domestic recycling year on year. But it does look like we're moving back towards a slight increase in export for 2023. One slightly concerning figure within this is that the amount of this material that was being sent to non-OECD countries actually increased. So in 2021, it was around 5%. In 2022, it was up to 16%. And for 2023, it looks like it may have increased slightly again. This could be due to a more accurate recording of the data in terms of the declaration of where the material is ending up, or it could be sort of falling back into a more normalized system of export after the impacts and the challenges that were created, particularly by the pandemic. 46% is still a huge amount to be exporting, so it does show the need for more domestic recycling infrastructure, particularly for those types previously mentioned, which would assume it's harder to recycle plastics in the UK that are being exported. And also the markets this year have been extremely challenging, and indeed for the last few years when it's come to packaging recovery notes, so the responsibility system. £228 million was raised through the PRN system for plastics alone in 2022. So by comparison, that's out of 490 million for all materials. So that's a significant amount of material, significant amount of money that should have gone into the plastics recycling industry for its development, both in terms of infrastructure, communications, and other. One of the challenges we see with this is the volatility in the prices. So the highs and lows are extremely varied, and this makes it very challenging for infrastructure to use these as a reliable assumption in terms of investment for new infrastructure or increased capacity. This has been combined with the fact that recycled plastic prices and demands have been low this year, extremely challenging, and that's not just in the UK, that's across the board in Europe, making the availability of cheap virgin polymer driving down the value and the incentive or the demand for recycled content. So this is it's been an extremely challenging time, and it's something we expect will go into 2024 as well. Just going to hand over to Laura for Citizen Communications. You're on mute, Laura.
Sorry. I knew it was going to happen. Hi, yeah, thank you. So how the consumer performs at home when it comes to placing their items for collection is an important first step to producing a high-performing recycling sector in the UK. Communication to citizens is crucial in the effort to driving up collection quantities and reducing contamination. So reducing contamination is not only increases the amount of recyclable material that is captured correctly and therefore able to pass through the recycling journey, but it also increases the quality of the recycler through the absence of non-target materials. This is why each year contamination is identified by local authorities as a key area of focus for their communication campaigns. The 2023 survey found that of the local authorities who have run a comms campaign in the last 3 years, 62% focused their message around the reduction of contamination. Other areas of focus for these comms campaigns was 57% talking about reduce, reuse, recycle, 26% addressing the reduction of fly tipping, and 24% concentrating on the reduction of litter. 24% of the local authorities said their comms campaigns looked at clarifying target and non-target materials. With the introduction of simpler recycling in England, seeing a consistent set of materials being collected across the country from households from 2027, the focus of these campaigns is likely to shift from the material itself to how the material is presented. Every year, the survey looks at all local authority websites to understand service provision, as well as the messaging communicated to residents regarding how to place their recycling for curbside collection. This message varies across the UK, both in language used and instructions given. For example, when looking at the bottle lids, we found 35% asked for citizens to leave the lids on the bottles. However, 14% asked for these lids to be left off. The remaining 51% didn't communicate a preference. They either said that their lids could be left off or left or put on, or they simply didn't provide any instruction at all. There is also often inconsistency in what is communicated around the bottle lid itself and whether a loose lid could be placed for recycling or not. Other examples of instructions to residents that we looked at included 74% specifying the items should be empty, rinsed and or washed, 49% asking for items to be flattened or squashed, and 48% asking for items to be disposed of loose and bagged. 8% of local authorities are still using polymer codes to communicate to residents around target items. The language used by local authorities not only differs when it comes to instruction, but also to items themselves, for example, films, soft plastic, cling film, etc. This can add additional unnecessary complexity and confusion, something that should be minimalised to ensure the reduction in non-target items making their way into the recycling streams. Next slide, please, Tom. So Pledge to Recycle Plastics is a national plastics recycling initiative managed by RECOUP with the aim to reduce citizen confusion. Increasing the material quality through the promotion of waste reduction and recycling of plastics is one of the main aims of RECOUP, and Pledge to Recycle Plastics provides education and guidance to enable citizens of all ages to recycle more and recycle right. Pledge has just launched its new website with simple and concise language concentrating on answering those common questions asked around the recycling of plastics, some of which you can see on this slide. The website includes videos showing the recycling journey of plastics packaging through its collection, sorting, reprocessing, and the new products made. Pledge to Recycle Plastics also has a range of ready-made resources, information, and communication campaigns to help support and work together with local authorities. Next slide, please, Tom. So I'll pass back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Another part of the survey that we've picked up in the last couple of years is around plastic waste crime, so particularly litter and fly tipping, and the areas that affect and cost local authorities a lot of money each year. So we asked the question around how local authorities felt their area was in terms of litter, and 51% said that they felt that they were predominantly free of litter and refuse, apart from small items. Fly tipping is seen as a greater problem than litter at 60%, 60-40 split. And also, although only 30% reported a year-on-year increase in litter and fly tipping, this is against a trend of previous years. So particularly during the pandemic time, this seemed to increase quite significantly. It's still around 30% compared to last year, 30% increase. But this is something that has plateaued a bit since 2021 data. The most common area of concern in terms of litter and fly tipping was highways and public roads. So 39% of local authorities identified that. 25% said retail and commercial areas of town centres. 21% residential areas. 5% industrial and 5% rural areas, and 4% for rivers and riverbanks. 90% of local authorities who responded to the question said that they conduct litter picking activities, while 65% enforce penalties when it comes to littering, and 46% have undertaken communication campaigns specifically with a view to reducing litter and fly tipping in their area. So policy and legislation, there's a number of areas of policy and legislation that we could go into, but looking at the ones that particularly will affect the local authorities going forward, or the curbside collections in particular. So the 25-year environmental plan going back to 2018, which sort of enabled a number of these policies. We've seen the plastic packaging tax introduced back in April 2022, with a view of driving the use of recycled content in packaging. Extended producer responsibility, which should be brought in the next few years and will presumably be funding the full collection and processing and management, I suppose, of plastic packaging that's placed on the markets. Simpler recycling. So back when the survey was initially sent out in May, this was consistency in household and business recycling in England. So this is the standardising of materials that will be collected at curbside, and potentially how. But this is looking at England only, and also the widespread 100% provision that we would see for the curbside recycling collection of pot stubs and trays and plastic films and flexibles in particular. We've seen single-use plastic legislation now introduced in England, Wales, and Scotland. So there are some nuances and difference between the three, but England and Wales both introduced theirs in October this year. Scotland's was last year. Northern Ireland is still awaiting the introduction of the EU, or the official enforcement of the EU single-use plastic legislation. And deposit return schemes. So this year we've seen the Scottish scheme in particular struggle. due to be introduced in August, and then it wasn't, and is now due to be introduced from October 2025 at the earliest. So that does bring it largely in line with England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but this does still raise questions around, firstly, the impact on the local authority waste composition, so the removal of valuable PET bottles and aluminium cans from the curbside stream. And there's also still questions around the inclusion of glass for both Wales and Scotland, as their governments seem keen to introduce them, whilst England and Northern Ireland don't. The Republic of Ireland is due to introduce its own deposit return scheme in February next year. And this creates a new sort of bespoke set of challenges around the cross-border with Northern Ireland, not only in terms of the logistics of how it will work, but different currencies. There'll be a modulated fee on packaging. So it'll be interesting to see how that scheme develops and ultimately when Northern Ireland's DRS is introduced, how it will coexist. There's also due to be a consultation on the ban of export to non-OECD countries. So going back to the previous slide where around 16% of exports were going to non-OECD countries. This is largely in line with what the EU is also consulting on for its member states. But there's also some complexity there in terms of how that will work and the wider impact that will have. And there's also a lot of discussion around green claims as well. So the perceived greenwashing that is sometimes seen on packaging, the claims that are made. RECOUP will be doing a piece of work on this going forward to understand the challenges and the issues that are there. On the right, you can see the recycling target, so 61% for 2022, and this remains the case for 23 and 24. And this will change in line with the introduction of the ambitious targets that we'll see with EPR. We did ask local authorities of their views on policy and legislation, so predominantly very supportive, particularly for EPR. 83% of local authorities said that they were supportive or strongly supportive. 39% said that they were supportive or strongly supportive of deposit return schemes. 19% said that they were against or strongly against, and the rest were neutral or didn't want to say. Consistent collections comes with a caveat because this question was asked before the change to simpler recycling, but 78% was supportive of an introduction of consistent collections. 85% supportive or strongly supportive of single-use plastic legislation, and 51% was supportive of a ban of export to non-OECD countries. The only sort of significant pushback there, in terms of all those policies, or not pushback, but in terms of doubt perhaps, is around deposit return schemes, and that's presumably because of the impact on the local authority waste stream and the value of that material. And there's a point there at the end that whilst that's supportive or against, this is all assuming that these policies are brought in a logical and constructive way, that they're well communicated, they're efficient, and they are driving towards the overall aims going back to the 25-year environmental plan. Finally, within the survey, there are a number of case studies. So Bring It Back case study, which is looking at a reusable cup return system that was trialled in Peterborough, RECOUP in combination with PECT. Durham Recycles, which was a pledge to recycle scheme with Durham County Council, looking at the messaging and the improving the recycling rates in the curbside. And also a short case study on the Republic of Ireland and how it's set up there. So looking at how the consistent collection that they operate across the country, the impact on recycling rates, and generally how that compares to the UK and what the UK could potentially learn from that system if it were to adopt something similar. So they are within the survey. I'm going to hand back to Steve for any questions.
Thank you very much, Tom and Laura. That was really, really useful, and there's a lot of data in there. Of course, there's an awful lot more actually in the survey report itself. But it's how we put that into context and how we use that as evidence as policies developed in the UK, which is going to be important. We do have a few questions. There was one around the collection of plant pots and how they are categorized as packaging, or in the past they've been categorized as non-packaging. Certainly we've seen evidence that plant pots are collected as part of in curbside schemes. 11% of local authorities do that. and from my understanding, plant pots are categorized as packaging. Is that your understanding, Tom?
From the survey's point of view, I think that the packaging element, the messaging from local authorities, 11% say it's accepted as recycling at curbside. And when it comes to the data, because of the way the data is reported, plant pots within the mixed plastics, presumably within the mixed plastics, will be counted towards those figures. But I think there is a bit of a caveat and a question mark to sort of the actual definition. But in terms of how local authorities communicate plant pots, 11% are communicating them broadly as a form of packaging and one that they collect or accept for recycling at curbside.
Yeah, I mean it's a very small stream of material, but it's still important to categorize correctly. So I see David Dawes put on a comment there. So we'll just make sure we check that and get the positions aligned correctly. There was another question here around, is there a view from local authorities on how far they feel the packaging and collection reforms will have an impact on their recycling in their areas? Was there also any reference to how they might begin to communicate these changes to members of the public, including the simpler recycling materials and food waste, etc.? This is a common question that it comes up in a lot of the collection reform meetings. Tom, specifically for feedback from the survey itself, how has this been met, this question?
Well, in terms of communication, we did ask some questions specifically around things like food waste and how they would be introduced, or the challenges that would be introduced. And to be honest, from the anecdotal responses, it was more around the government communication to the council rather than the council's communication to its citizens. A lot of these responses were before simpler recycling was rebranded, or however you want to describe it. So in terms of communication, I think the focus is still there. There seems to be a lot of sort of status quo for the provision at the moment, subject to these changes coming in. And I mean, we've seen some specific examples in the media of councils who are looking to get an exemption or a delay to the introduction of food waste, for example, because of their existing contracts. So I think the focus is perhaps more how they're going to introduce it rather than how they're going to communicate it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen is that there's obviously a nervousness around when the payments will come through, and also how much of those payments as well. So it's really a difficult position of how to plan for the future when you kind of know what you need to do, but you don't know how you're going to get there. And of course, how the operations, logistics, the impacts on the resources required is just an unknown. So I can completely understand how that's going to affect planning in the future, and we can just hope more and more information and detail comes through quickly on that front. That's a good question, though. There's another question here regarding the opinions from local authorities on policy development. So it might be that this is just the individuals we speak to. So we put out an online questionnaire to every UK local authority, and we get hard data, we get data back of what plastics they've collected, but we also get opinion. So this might be more personal opinion than that of the local authority. It's difficult to understand, but the question is, why do you think DRS and export bans receive less support from local authorities? Tom, is that something you're able to?
For DRS, I think it's down to the stream of materials, so it's the impact it'll have on the value of the curbside stream, because focusing on plastic specifically, regardless of the other materials that be within DRS, the PET milk bottle, the PET drinks bottles are predominantly the more valuable plastic with HDPE milk bottles. And I think there's been some uncertainty, or there has been some uncertainty of what the knock-on impact that would be, particularly in relation to the introduction of EPR. So without the details of dates, times, and value, or the money that we brought in through EPR, I think that's probably where the uncertainty for DRS comes in. for exports, for the most part, I would assume it's down to existing, existing streams. OECD is quite a broad brush. I mean, if you look at the list of countries that are exported to, the OECD ones tend to be the ones that we sent to, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, or places like China, which would have been non-OECD. So I assume it's based on existing export deals, rather than being against the policy necessarily, that perhaps, they're being sent to countries where there is a facility. There's non-OECD countries have good facilities, OECD countries have not good facilities. It's not as black and white as it perhaps could be made out in a policy, and perhaps there's just councils that have that existing contract or set up to export their material.
I think as we look to the future, I think there's definitely a push, and of course an ambition to treat more of the material in the UK, regardless of where it actually ends up. But of course the restrictions around where it goes and the notifications required and how that material is ultimately reprocessed is going to be very interesting to follow. Digital waste tracking particularly would have a big impact on that front. Separate question is around, do you have any, this is a good one, do you have any predictions for next year's survey results? So I think when we looked at it last year's survey, and we maybe look forward to this year and what we're going to get out of it, we thought, well, there's going to be a likely reduction in the plastic packaging that's used. Material substitution to other materials is a consideration. Lightweighting is a continual consideration as well. So I think there's going to continue to be a reduction in plastic packaging used. So that consequently is going to reduce the level. If collection rates, actually the collection tonnages increase, the collection rates will go up as well. So Tom, have you got any other thoughts regarding next year?
No, I think there's not due to be any major policies introduced, which should have a major impact. Although the plastic packaging waste regulations in Europe, what the knock-on effect will be there. We're seeing increased focus on things like reuse, which is a section in the survey, which may also reduce the amount of packaging placed on the market or within the waste stream, but we suspect that's quite low at the minute. And whether that's packaging or which areas of packaging, whether the packaging tax, if there's any changes to packaging tax, whether that will increase sort of recycled content and or focus on plastics or move away from plastics. It's a dangerous question to try and answer, because I think if we'd answered in 2018, or 2019, we wouldn't have predicted the impact of COVID, or if we, anything else that's happened since. So I think, we'll continue to see a reduction of what's placed on the market. And hopefully now that simpler recycling has been confirmed and there are some dates written down, local authorities can start planning for the future in terms of increasing provision. That remaining 12% that doesn't collect hot stubs and trays, or the remaining 88 that doesn't collect films and flexibles, they can start to move towards collecting those materials, and that might see an increase.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a separate question here around the recycling target of plastic is 61%. Do you know what the recycling rate is for PET trays? Now, PET trays are an interesting one because they fall, obviously they're not bottles. They need a separate recycling reprocessing infrastructure to handle them. And Tom, again, I presume they fall into the plastic pot tubs and trays fraction. I think the collection rate rather, shouldn't get that wrong. The collection rate is just shy of 40%.
Yeah, it's at 39% collection rate for all pots, tubs and trays. There is a bit of a breakdown based on what's placed on the market. So I suppose proportionately there could be an assumption of what's collected, but I think the distinction between collection and recycling, I think, is really key, particularly for anything non-bottle. So yeah, the recycling target of plastic is 61%. The collection of trays, 39% across all polymers.
I mean, if you look at where the future activity needs to be, I mean, nearly 90% of local authorities collect pot stubs and trays. The infrastructure to actually reprocess that material is limited in that regard. So certainly there's good markets for polypropylene fraction, but PET trays are certainly something that needs to have more focus on. Indeed, actually, it's a good time to mention in 2024, we intend to update our sorting and reprocessing infrastructure report. The last report was in 2022. So this looks at the capacities to sort and reprocess plastic packaging into new raw materials. And I think there's quite a bit of work to do looking at future targets and exactly where the efforts need to be. See, pots, tubs and trays is one, but plastic films and flexibles is an absolute key. When you look at certainly all local authorities in England will be collecting it from 2027. I don't think there's any other questions at the moment, but of course, if you do have any other questions, please do get in touch with the team. We will be looking to plan next year's plastic packaging collection survey soon. So we'll start looking through websites. We will be putting together our questions. And on that regard, if any members have questions that they would like us to ask local authorities, do get in touch. We go through a process of reviewing all the questions, and our questions go around in about April time. So yeah, if you want to get in touch to discuss any of the points from today, and also indeed next year's survey, please do so. Just finally, a big thank you to the local authorities that completed the survey this year. They do take time out of their days to enter data for us, to provide opinions. They get on the phone, and to have a nearly 80% response rate is absolutely fantastic. And we couldn't do this without them. And also the waste management companies as well that provide the services and contracts for local authorities. They've been super helpful. And many are actually RECOUP members as well. So just a big thank you to all of those. The press release will go out hopefully in the next couple of days. It might go into the beginning of next week, but that will be very soon. And also the recording and slides from today will be made available as well for you. So I hope you found that useful. And say, if you get any questions, do get in touch with us, and please enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you very much for your time, and see you next year.
Thank you.